All right, so homesteading. Huh. We are going deep on this one, folks, trying to figure out how this whole dream of free land really ended up shaping the American West.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Big one, for sure.
Yeah.
We've got a whole stack of articles, historical accounts, personal stories even.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
we do, we do. So if you think you know homesteading, you might just be in for some surprises.
You know, what I find fascinating is how this idea of free land, just that simple concept, sparked a huge movement.
Yeah.
People coming from all over the world trying to get their piece.
Yeah,
But it's also a story about the ripple effect, right? It really shaped the lives of Native Americans who are already living on these lands.
exactly. We're going to undo how all of it, the Homestead Act, what life was like for the people who claimed their 160 acres, and how it all echoes even today. But before we jump ahead to the 1862 Homestead Act, we've got to understand what things were like before, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've got to rewind a bit, go back to the Land Ordinance of 1785. It was put in place to bring some order to the land claims after the Revolutionary War. You know, a brand new nation trying to figure out how to manage this massive amount of territory.
So the land ordinance, they were literally trying to bring some order to the Wild West. Did it actually work?
Well, the idea was good, you know, it's a neat grid system,
Okay.
but there was a catch.
Uh-oh.
A full section of land was 640 acres.
Okay.
And that cost $1 per acre. Now, that might not sound like a lot now, but back then, that was a huge chunk of change. Imagine a farmer or someone who just immigrated here trying to scrape that much money together.
That's a steep price for someone just starting out, for sure.
Yeah.
So what did they do to try to make land, a little more accessible? Did they offer discounts, payment plans, anything like that?
They did try. They really did. Over time, they lowered prices, and they even brought in these installment plans to help people out. But for many, land ownership was still out of reach. And that just fueled more tension, especially for the settlers out west who were desperate for a system that actually worked for them, you know?
It's really interesting how central this whole idea of owning your own land was to the American identity, even way back then.
Yeah.
These people were willing to pack up their entire lives, head west, just for a chance to own a piece of that dream.
Yeah.
It feels like things were getting ready for some major changes.
Exactly. That's where this idea of preemption comes in. It's basically settlers in the West arguing, hey, we should be able to settle on the land first and pay for it later. Kind of a settle now, pay later deal for land.
So like a layover plan for land.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds pretty appealing, especially for folks heading west who couldn't afford to buy land outright.
It was a big draw, but, not everyone was on board with this preemption idea.
Right.
Created this whole political back and forth, different groups fighting it out.
Sounds like he was getting pretty heated.
Yeah.
Who was against this settle now, pay later plan?
Well, imagine you're a factory owner back east, okay?
Okay.
And you hear about this free land out west. What happens? Workers start leaving their jobs to become landowners. So the factory owners, they were worried about losing their workforce to this lure of free land.
Right, hold on. We need those workers to keep these factories running.
Exactly.
And what about the South?
The South had a whole other set of concerns. Yep.
Right.
Deeply divided they were over slavery. Adding new states and potentially anti-slavery states on top of that would just mess up the balance of power in Congress. So that fear of upsetting the political apple cart really fueled their opposition to this whole free land idea in the West.
So it's this big clash, economic interest, political interest, all happening while the country's expanding west and everyone's chasing this dream of owning their own land. And right in the middle of all this, 1862, boom, the Homestead Act.
Such a defining moment. It was decades of debate and all this advocacy that led up to it. It's incredible to think about figures like George Henry Evans,
Yeah.
who actually coined the phrase, vote yourself a farm. Wow. He and so many others, they campaigned tirelessly to make land ownership a reality for everyday Americans.
Powerful slogan, for sure.
Yeah.
It speaks to just how much hope and aspiration were tied to this whole idea of owning land. Finally, a way to own land opened up for a lot of people, though, as we'll see, not everyone. So what were the rules of this Homestead Act? What did you have to do to get a piece of this American dream?
First off, you had to be a U.S. citizen, or at least declare your intention to become one. And there was this specific clause that said anyone who had fought against the U.S. government, they couldn't participate.
Right. No rewarding rebels with free land.
Yeah.
especially during the Civil War. Makes sense.
Exactly. And they also wanted to make sure people were loyal to the Union. You
Right.
couldn't just show up and say, this land is mine.
Right.
You had to live on it for 5 years, consecutive years.
Wow.
Real commitment. You couldn't just buy it and sell it off. You had to put in the work, improve it, cultivate the land, the whole deal. They weren't giving away free land to just anyone.
5 years, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Especially considering everything those folks were dealing with out west. But you could buy the land. Right.
Here.
If you didn't want to wait.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Didn't want to wait the whole 5 years. You could buy it after 6 months,
Right.
$1.25 an acre. But, not everyone had that kind of money just lying around.
Yeah.
Especially after paying to travel west and getting settled. It was a real gamble no matter how you looked at it.
Okay, so picture this.
Yeah.
It's the 1860s. No internet, no social media. How were people finding out about this Homestead Act? Town criers.
Word of mouth, for sure. Imagine people hanging out at the general store, swapping stories and news.
Okay.
But there were some more organized efforts, too.
Like what?
The railroads were really pushing homesteading.
Oh, interesting.
It was in their best interest to get people moving west. More settlers, more people using their trains, more demand for the stuff they were shipping.
That's a great point. The railroads were running this giant marketing campaign, painting a pretty picture of life on the frontier.
Right.
Like those ads you see now about living off the grid, all sunshine and fresh air. But for the people who actually packed up and went, I'm guessing the reality was a bit different, huh?
Yeah, those brochures, they left out the tough parts.
Right.
Homesteaders had to deal with some brutal conditions. Blizzards that could bury a homestead in snow, droughts that dried everything out, hailstorms that wiped out entire crops in a matter of minutes.
That's just brutal. It's hard to imagine. And I read that they had these massive swarms of grasshoppers, like descending on the field, eating everything.
Oh, yeah. Like something out of a nightmare. Swarms so big they'd block out the sun, and in a couple of hours, a whole field would be gone. It's no wonder so many homesteaders struggled.
And resources.
Mm.
I read about a lack of basic stuff, like trees. Trees. Pretty important.
Especially out on the plains, trees were like gold.
Yeah.
Homesteaders had to get really creative, building their homes out of sod.
Out of dirt.
Basically dirt held together by grass roots. And firewood, another big worry. Every little piece of wood was precious. They had to be super careful with how much they burned, make it last, especially during those harsh winters.
Yeah. It makes you appreciate what we have today.
Yeah.
Just having wood, reliable heat, it's not something we usually think about.
No.
And speaking of challenges, the size of the homesteads themselves,
Yeah.
160 acres seems like a lot. But was it enough to actually support a whole family?
That's a good question. 160 acres seems like a decent chunk, but out on the Great Plains, with how dry it wasn't always enough to make farming work. They couldn't just farm the way they did back east where there was more rain.
Right.
So a lot of homesteaders had to try other things, raising livestock, other ways to get by.
So it's constant battle against the weather, limited resources, and the land itself.
Yeah.
Tough.
Tough. And every homesteader's experience was different, too. Some came with, generations of farming knowledge. Others were from the city, no idea what they were in for. And money. Some came with savings. Others barely had enough to get west.
So homesteading was almost like a lottery.
Yeah. Some hit it big. Others barely made it.
Exactly. And within all that, there are these individual stories.
Oh, yeah.
Stories of incredible resilience, heartbreaking loss. These personal accounts are gold. They give us a glimpse into the human side of this whole movement.
Absolutely. They bring it to life.
Yeah, we've got some amazing stories here. For example, Daniel Freeman. He's considered by many to be the very first homesteader.
No kidding.
Yep. Filed his claim minutes after the Homestead Act took effect. Talk about being eager.
I bet he was camped out in front of the land office, application ready to go. It shows you just how badly people wanted to own land and how much hope this act represented.
Right. And then there's the story of Louise Lane Trace. She went west with her family when she was just 16 years old.
Oh, wow.
Imagine that, grasshopper plagues, almost starving at that age.
Her story is incredible, really shows you the strength and determination of these homesteaders. And, it also highlights how important community was on the frontier.
Yeah.
Their crops fail, they relied on their neighbors for food. Those social bonds, they were crucial for survival.
It's a powerful reminder that even with all the hardship and isolation, they found ways to support each other and build a sense of community.
Yeah.
There's also Charity Couch, who homesteaded near the South Platte River. She talks about being isolated and the constant danger from all the cattle roaming around.
Yeah, she paints this picture of life on the frontier that's both beautiful and incredibly challenging. It shows how ranching and homesteading became intertwined, you know?
Right.
A lot of homesteaders, like Charity, they realized that raising cattle was more realistic than trying to farm on the dry plains.
And there's one more story I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
A German-Russian immigrant family, they left everything behind and arrived to find nothing but earth and sky. It's a stark image, isn't it?
It is. You know, it challenges that classic image of the lone male homesteader.
Right.
Women were absolutely essential to homesteading.
Oh, wait.
They were farmers, builders, caregivers, you name it. Their contributions were vital.
Absolutely. In this story, it was the women who really took charge, using their skills to build a life from practically nothing.
Amazing.
These stories are just a small sample of the millions who took part in this massive land rush. They give us a sense of the grit, determination, the sheer hope that fueled this whole movement.
It's important to remember, though, not everyone was looking to put down roots and build a farm.
Right.
Some saw it as a quick way to make money. Land speculators were always lurking around, looking for ways to exploit the system.
Right. We came across this account of a guy named Lorenzo Meri. He was bouncing around the frontier, squatting on land, even resorting to violence to protect his claim.
Oh, wow.
He represents this whole darker side of the Homestead Act, this opportunism and lawlessness that popped up on the edges of civilization.
It's a good reminder that the Homestead Act wasn't this idyllic, romanticized process.
Yeah.
It was messy, chaotic, and often driven by personal ambition, good and bad. It's a complicated story with a lot of different viewpoints.
Absolutely. So we've set the stage, talked about the requirements, even met some of the people who live this life.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out a bit and look at the big picture impact of the Homestead Act.
Yeah.
Out of the millions who filed claims, how many actually got their deed?
It's a good question. And the answer might surprise you. Of the roughly 2 million claims filed, less than 40% actually got a deed. That means over half of those who tried to homestead failed.
Wow. That's a pretty harsh reality.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that contributed to that low success rate?
Well, we talked about some of them already. The harsh weather, lack of resources, sometimes even the homesteads themselves just weren't big enough.
Yeah.
But there were other things at play, too. Some folks just weren't cut out for the lifestyle.
It's easy to romanticize this living off the land idea,
Yeah.
but it's really hard work. Constantly fighting the elements, dealing with setbacks, having to adapt.
Exactly. Homesteading took a very specific set of skills, not just farming. You had to know how to build, solve problems, and be resilient. Not everyone was ready for that level of self-sufficiency.
So what about the people who did stick it out? What helped them succeed?
Transportation improved a lot, things like the railroads expanding.
Right.
That made a big difference. It was easier to get supplies, take crops to market, connect with the rest of the world.
So access to those networks, to markets, to information, that was crucial.
Absolutely. And then there were the things you can't really measure, like pure grit, support from their community, even a bit of luck.
Right.
Some homesteaders just happened to end up on land that was better for farming, or they have family and friends who could help them through tough times.
It sounds like success or failure came down to a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But beyond individual outcomes, what about the bigger impact? How did the Homestead Act shape the West and the entire country?
One of the biggest impacts, and it's a complicated one, was how it affected Native Americans. The Homestead Act opened up land that was already inhabited by indigenous tribes.
That's right. It really pushed Native Americans off their land.
Yeah, the Homestead Act and policies that came after, like the Dawes Act, they systematically chipped away at tribal lands.
Exactly. The Dawes Act, which was passed in 1887, it was supposed to assimilate Native Americans.
Yeah.
Breaking up reservations, giving land to individuals. The idea was they'd become farmers,
Yeah.
integrated into American society.
Right.
But it was basically just a way to take their land, disguised as progress.
Yep.
It took away their communal land and opened it up for white settlers.
Yeah. It had devastating consequences for Native American culture and their ability to govern themselves.
Right.
It disrupted their traditions, forced assimilation, and marginalized them even further.
It's a dark part of American history, and it's tied directly to the Homestead Act. It shows that progress often has hidden costs, and those costs usually fall on the people who are already marginalized.
Yeah, exactly. But, despite all that, the Homestead Act did have a lasting impact. There are still farms out there, scattered across the Great Plains, that have been in the same family for over 100 years.
Century farms. They're like monuments to the grit and perseverance of those early homesteaders.
Yeah.
They represent a connection to the land, family history, a legacy that still shapes those communities.
And it's not just about the farms themselves.
Right.
That whole spirit of homesteading, that self-reliance, it's still a part of so many Western communities. It's part of who they are.
Exactly. It's not just in the West either.
Yeah.
Those principles of homesteading, the self-sufficiency, the resourcefulness, the connection to the land, people are embracing those all over the country, even in cities.
It's amazing how those core principles are being adapted for modern life.
Yeah,
It makes you think that the Homestead Act, even with all its complexities and contradictions, might still have things to teach us about how to live in a more sustainable and resilient way.
that's a great point. Maybe it can inspire us to reconnect with those values, self-reliance, community, a deeper understanding of how we relate to the land,
Yeah.
all things that were so central to the homesteading experience.
It's a legacy worth exploring,
Yeah,
both for its historical significance and for what it might teach us about living and thriving today.
absolutely. Now, we've talked about the past, the present, but what about the future of homesteading? Is it even relevant in today's world, this modern, hyper-connected world?
That's a question a lot of people are asking, and you know what? The answer is a resounding yes. Homesteading is making a comeback, but it's changing to fit the realities of the 21st century.
So it's not just about pioneering the wilderness anymore.
Not at all. While some folks still want that off-grid, back-to-nature life, modern homesteading is about taking those core principles and using them anywhere, even in cities.
That makes sense. Not everyone can just pick up and move to a huge plot of land or wants to completely disconnect.
Yeah.
So how are people taking those homesteading values and using them today?
Self-sufficiency. That could mean growing your own food, even if it's just herbs on a windowsill or a raised bed in your backyard. It's about having some control over where your food comes from, even in a small way.
I've seen that for sure. Urban gardening is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
Community gardens popping up everywhere. People are realizing you don't need a farm to connect with nature and grow your own food.
Exactly. And then there's energy. Modern homesteading is about using renewable sources, things like solar panels or wind turbines.
Right.
It's about depending less on the power grid, whether you're in a farmhouse or a city apartment.
It ties into that preparedness thing we talked about.
Yeah.
Being ready if things go wrong, like power outages, water shortages, disruptions to the food supply. It feels more relevant now than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Modern homesteading is also about sustainability. Things like composting, cutting down on waste, conserving water, all of those things line up with the core values of homesteading.
It's like a whole way of thinking about life. Considering how your actions impact the environment, your community, even future generations. It's about taking responsibility.
Exactly. And let's not forget about skills.
Right.
Modern homesteading is about rediscovering old school skills, canning, sewing, woodworking, even just basic repairs. It's about being able to do things yourself instead of buying mass-produced stuff or relying on someone else to fix things for you.
There's something really satisfying about that. About being able to make and fix things with your own hands.
It's about taking back some of that control.
Yeah.
And those skills, they're valuable not just in a crisis, but in everyday life, too. They help you be more creative, better at problem solving, and more connected to the things you use.
So it seems like homesteading today isn't really about a specific place or way of living, but more about a way of thinking.
Yeah.
It's about self-sufficiency, sustainability, and community.
You got it.
And it's a way of thinking that's connecting with more and more people, especially as we're dealing with climate change, economic uncertainty, and this growing awareness of how fragile our world really is.
You're absolutely right. So in a way, homesteading is going back to its roots. It started as a way to get land and build a life. Now it's helping people deal with the challenges of modern life by using those same timeless values.
That's a great point. And what's really interesting is how modern technology is actually playing a big role in this resurgence. Things like online communities, how-to videos, social media, they're all connecting people interested in homesteading. They're sharing knowledge, inspiring each other.
Yeah, it's like the homesteading spirit is being reignited, but with the help of modern tools that those early pioneers could only dream of.
Exactly. It's creating a new generation of homesteaders who are changing what it means to live sustainably, to be self-reliant, and to build community in a world that's changing faster than ever. It's pretty incredible to see how the legacy of the Homestead Act keeps evolving and inspiring people in so many different ways.
It really is. It shows how those core values, self-sufficiency, community, connection to the land, they're still relevant and meaningful today.
Well, we've covered a lot today.
Yeah.
From the history of the Homestead Act to its modern-day comeback, What stands out to you the most?
The resilience of people. Whether it was facing those blizzards on the Great Plains or figuring out how to grow food in a city, people have always found ways to adapt, overcome challenges, and build a better life.
I agree completely. I think that's the lasting impact of the Homestead Act. It's
Yeah.
not just about free land, it's about that spirit of innovation, resilience, and community that it represented.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have one more thought for you to think about. What part of that homesteading spirit speaks to you?
Mm.
And how can you, even in your own small way, take those values and create a life that's more connected, more sustainable, and more meaningful?
That's a great question for all of us. Because even though the days of free land are long gone, that spirit of homesteading is still here, waiting to be rediscovered and reimagined for a new generation.
Exactly. It's amazing to think about, how those early homesteaders shaped the landscape, literally and figuratively,
Yeah.
turning all that prairie into farmland, building towns and communities, and really leaving their mark on what it means to be American.
It's a story woven into the fabric of our country, but like we've seen, it's a story with a lot of complexities and contradictions.
Oh, absolutely. The Homestead Act gave a lot of people opportunities, but it also had a huge impact on Native Americans, leading to their displacement and the erosion of their way of life.
It's a reminder that progress, often comes at a price, and
Yeah,
that price isn't always paid fairly.
exactly. As we dig deeper, it's important that we acknowledge those complexities to really understand the full scope of the Homestead Act's impact.
I couldn't agree more. So let's shift back to the people who went west for their 160 acres. We've talked about the struggles, the weather, the lack of resources. But what about the successes? What did they do that worked? What helped them thrive?
Well, one key thing was adapting. They had to be incredibly resourceful and ready to learn new ways of doing things. They couldn't just keep doing what they did back east.
Can you give us some examples of how they adapted to the Great Plains?
Yeah, for sure. One big one was dry farming. Traditional farming needed a lot of rain.
Right.
But on the plains, homesteaders had to conserve every drop. So they tried drought-resistant crops, new ways of planting, even different plowing techniques to trap moisture in the soil.
It's amazing how they were able to innovate and find solutions.
They were true pioneers, not just settling the land, but also in pushing the boundaries of agriculture.
And we talked about how important community was on the frontier. How did they work together to get through things and make life better?
Community was everything. Homesteaders depended on each other, sharing resources and work, giving emotional support, and just being there for each other.
I can imagine how isolated and lonely it must have been out there.
Oh, absolutely. Miles between neighbors, harsh conditions that made travel tough. Building strong community bonds was crucial, both practically and emotionally.
Can you give us some examples of how those communities functioned?
Sharing work was really common. They'd help each other raise barns, harvest crops, anything that needed a lot of hands.
Right.
It was more efficient,
Right.
and it gave them a chance to socialize.
Many hands make light work, right?
Exactly. And it wasn't just about work, of course.
Right.
They'd have dances, potlucks, church services. It gave them a sense of belonging and helped keep their traditions alive.
It sounds like these communities were incredibly resilient and supportive.
They had to be. They were up against huge challenges, and they knew they could only overcome them together.
And this working together, helping each other, it wasn't just on the homesteads, was it?
Nope, not at all. As towns and cities started popping up across the West, that same spirit of collaboration, it spread. People came together to build schools, churches, businesses, everything they needed for a growing population.
It's fascinating how these communities started from scratch, built by people who wanted a better life for themselves and their kids.
It's a real testament to human ingenuity and the power of working together. That's always been a big part of the American story.
So we've looked at the challenges, the adaptations, the successes of homesteading. But we also need to talk about the darker side, especially the impact on Native American communities.
Right. The displacement of Native Americans is a tragic part of American history, and it's inseparable from the legacy of the Homestead Act.
It's crucial to remember that while the Homestead Act opened doors for many, it came at a high cost for those already living on the land.
Exactly. The arrival of homesteaders disrupted traditional ways of life, led to fights over land and resources, and contributed to the forced removal and assimilation of Native American communities.
It's a hard truth to face.
It is. And as we explore this history, we need to be sensitive and really listen to the experiences of those who are most affected.
Let's dive deeper into what Native Americans went through. We talked about the Dawes Act, passed in 1887. Can you explain how that law further stripped tribes of their power and led to the loss of millions of acres?
The Dawes Act was a turning point in U.S. Native American relations. It moved away from the treaty system, which at least recognized tribal sovereignty in theory, and toward a policy of assimilation.
So instead of treating tribes as sovereign nations, the government decided to force them to live like white Americans.
Exactly. They wanted to break up reservations into individual plots, force Native Americans into private land ownership, the American model. They thought that if Native Americans became farmers and landowners, they'd blend into mainstream American culture.
Trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, it was. They completely ignored the cultural importance of communal land for many tribes, and it ended up causing them to lose millions of acres.
How did that happen?
The Dawes Act said any land that wasn't given to individual Native Americans was surplus and could be sold to white settlers. It was a land grab, plain and simple. Speculators and homesteaders were all over it, eager to claim their piece.
So the Dawes Act, even though it was supposed to be about giving land to Native Americans, it ended up benefiting white settlers more.
Sadly, yes. It was presented as a way to civilize Native Americans, but it really just took more of their land and damaged their culture.
It's a terrible irony.
It is. And the consequences of the Dawes Act are still felt today. Many Native American communities are still dealing with the fallout, the loss of land, poverty, and cultural disruption.
It's a reminder that the past isn't really over and done with. The effects of injustice can echo through generations.
You're absolutely right. And when we look at the impact of the Homestead Act on Native Americans, it's important to approach it with sensitivity and to listen to those whose lives were changed forever.
It reminds us that history isn't just dates and events. It's about real people, real lives, and real consequences that continue to affect people today.
Exactly. As we move forward, we need to learn from the past, understand how complicated it is, and work towards a future that's fair for everyone.
We've talked a lot about the past and present of homesteading. What about the future?
Yeah,
Is there a place for homesteading in our modern, increasingly urban world?
that's a good question, and it's one that more and more people are asking.
You're saying there's a renewed interest in homesteading.
Oh, definitely. There's a resurgence of interest in those core principles, even in cities.
Really? But how can people homestead without acres of land? What does urban homesteading even look like?
It's about adapting, taking those values of self-sufficiency, resourcefulness, and connection to the land, and applying them in a city.
Okay, give me some examples.
You don't need a farm to grow your own food.
Right.
You can have a container garden on your balcony, join a community garden, grow herbs and veggies inside.
So it's about connecting with nature and growing food, even if you live in a concrete jungle.
Exactly. It's about having some control over your food, even if it's just a little bit.
What about energy independence and DIY? How do those fit into a city?
Well, for energy, you could put solar panels on your roof or cut down on your energy use by making small changes to your lifestyle.
So it's about using less energy from the grid, whether you're in a house or an apartment.
Exactly. And DIY skills, maybe learning to fix your clothes, make your own cleaning products, or even build furniture out of recycled stuff.
It's about being resourceful in a world that wants us to just buy new things all the time.
Yeah, you got it. Urban homesteading is about being more self-reliant, connected to your community, and thinking about your impact on the planet.
There's a sense of empowerment in that, isn't there?
Absolutely. It's about taking control of your life, learning skills, and being part of a community of people who think the same way.
So even though free land isn't a thing anymore, that homesteading spirit is still around, popping up in new ways, even in cities.
Exactly. It's adapting to the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century.
It's pretty interesting how the Homestead Act still resonates with people today.
There really is.
It shows those basic values, the self-sufficiency, the community, that connection to the land. They still matter.
Absolutely. It's really fascinating to see how homesteading is being, reimagined for today. It's not just about the old-fashioned stuff anymore.
Right.
It's about finding these creative and innovative ways to live more sustainably, connect with their communities, and get back to some of that lost knowledge, those hands-on skills.
It strikes me that homesteading has always been about resilience at its core.
Yeah.
Whether it's those early pioneers facing those brutal conditions, or people in cities today finding ways to grow food in tiny spaces, it's all about resourcefulness and adapting.
Absolutely. It's about being prepared.
Right.
Not just for disasters, but for those everyday life things, too. It's having the know-how to take care of yourself, your family, no matter what comes your way.
It's about having that sense of control, knowing you're not completely dependent on systems or other people for your basic needs.
Yeah.
And that can be really powerful in a world that's, well, increasingly unpredictable.
I agree. And it's not just about individual empowerment either.
Right.
Homesteading also builds a sense of community, knowing you can count on your neighbors, your community for support when you need it.
Like they say, it takes a village. Homesteading reminds us that we're all in this together, that by working together, we can create a more resilient and sustainable future.
Exactly. And it's not just about surviving.
Yeah.
It's about thriving, creating a life with meaning, purpose, connection, connecting with the land, growing your food, learning those skills, building those relationships.
It's about living in a way that matches your values,
Yeah.
whether those are about sustainability or self-sufficiency, community, or just wanting a more authentic and fulfilling life.
You got it. And what's really exciting is that this renewed interest in homesteading is happening across generations. Young people, families, retirees, they're all getting into it.
It's like rediscovering something important that got lost somewhere along the way,
Yeah, exactly. It's not just nostalgia, though. It's recognizing that these values, these skills, they still matter today. In a world with all these huge challenges like climate change and running out of resources, homesteading shows us a path toward a more sustainable and resilient way of living.
It's like this ancient wisdom passed down over time, and now it's being rediscovered for a new time.
That's a great way to put it. You know, one of the things that I find so inspiring about this modern homesteading movement is that there's no one right way to do it.
Yeah, it's about finding what works for you.
Exactly. You, your family, your community, it's taking those core principles and making them work for your own situation.
Right.
Rural homestead, a house in the suburbs, an apartment in the city. There are ways to make it work, to create a life that reflects what's important to you.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into homesteading, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners take away?
I think the biggest thing is this. Homesteading isn't just a lifestyle, it's a way of thinking. It's approaching life with an emphasis on resilience, resourcefulness, and community. It's about taking care of yourself, connecting with nature, and building a better future.
And it's a journey.
Yeah.
It's not about reaching a specific destination. There's always something new to learn, new skills to develop, and new ways to connect with the land, with each other.
Absolutely. So whether you're a homesteading pro or just starting to explore these ideas, keep learning, keep growing, and keep that spirit alive.
Well said. This has been a really interesting journey exploring homesteading, from its history to how it's making a comeback today. And like we've seen, it's a story that's still unfolding.
Absolutely. And it's a story we can all be a part of.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of homesteading. We hope you've been inspired to connect with the land, embrace self-sufficiency, and build a more resilient and fulfilling life.
And remember, the spirit of homesteading is out there. It's waiting for anyone who's looking for a more connected, sustainable, and meaningful way to live.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that homesteading spirit alive.